Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the session. Thank you so much. It's a lovely autumn morning here in Bangalore and all you lovely people around. The larks on the wing, the snails on the thorn, God's in his heaven and all's right with the world. But who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of the men and women present here? Who knows if some of you are thinking of polishing off your husband who's been very annoying, and all husbands are annoying. If you've come here on this lovely morning in search of blood, gore, blunt instruments, sharp-witted detectives, you've come to the right place. So welcome on behalf of the Bangalore Lit Festival to everyone and this very distinguished international panel, people who've flown all the way from Australia, across the seven seas, from London and from England, where at least I certainly learnt much about my crime fiction, and from Bombay, Kiran, and from Bangalore, our local crime writer, Bhaskar. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you. Where is the body? That's the title of the session. Where indeed, and whose body, and what sort of terrible things have been done to those bodies? Our panel is going to take us through all of that today. So let's find out more about bodies, blood, gore, and things like that. So Bhaskar, let me start with you. A group of strangers invited to a lonely bungalow, and somebody gets bumped off. A question of mistaken identity. A girl who goes missing in the moonlight when the piano is playing on the beaches of a lovely but deserted Goanese village. Very atmospheric. And speaking of bodies, two dogs who have been found murdered by, as you call them, swift arrows. So very, very reminiscent of, and in the middle of it all, your creations, Janardhan Mighty, the detective, and Prakash Ray. Ray of Light? Is that the way you thought of it? Okay.
Satyajit Ray, yeah.
Satyajit Ray, Prakash Ray, Ray of Light. The chronicler who sheds light on, the nefarious murders that Janardhan Mighty uncovers all as part of his day's work. Very reminiscent of, the golden age of detective fiction. I don't know if I'm misreading it, but seemed to convey shades of Holmes and Watson, Byomkesh and Ajit, for people who are sort of familiar with the very, very popular Bengali detective. Potentially Feluda, the detective created by Satyajit Ray, and his chronicler Jatayu, who is also a novelist, like your novelist is.
Topshe is
accompanied by Jatayu the novelist, and Topshe the nephew. So are you sort of hearkening back to the sort of golden age of fiction that we talked about, of the Dorothy Sayers, Holmes, Christie age, and what's been your journey in that?
Sure. So yes, there's an obvious tribute which I pay to the golden age of detective fiction. I'm sure you'll understand. One grows up reading a certain kind of stories. And yesterday I was at Sophie's session, and Sophie mentioned that she was an avid fan of Agatha Christie's stories right from the age of 12. Something similar here. And after a certain point of time, you have exhausted those kind of stories, and you suddenly realize that such kind of stories are not being written anymore, and at least in this country. There is an obvious tendency to make sure that we get more and more of those kind of stories, and one thing that I could do at least was to keep going back to those stories, but that is something which you can do only to a certain point of time, and a certain number of times, which is why and of course I was not alone. I had friends, I had other fellow enthusiasts in crime fiction who had similar issues. They said, so good, I guess. My readers will judge, of course, but I have not faced any problems marrying to completely different eras. Yeah. So,
I expect it must be difficult finding your locales. Isolated places are quite difficult in the modern age. Humanity has spread like a plague all over the planet. So, but that challenge apart, what I find very difficult, and I've tried my hand at writing, the sort of novels that I admire, which is the sort of novels which are plot driven and so on, and have a very clever puzzle at the heart of it. I've really found that very difficult. I think I'm more in the thriller genre than the detective genre myself, and I find it very difficult to construct these clever little puzzles. I don't know how you find that experience, and whether you've picked up learned from the old masters. You've picked up a few of their tricks and trades, the red herring, the alibi that's not really an alibi, the murder weapon that's very cleverly concealed somewhere else. So, any of these sort of tricks and trades that you've picked up, or lessons you've picked up from the old masters that you'd like to share with us in terms of plot construction? Yeah,
sure. Like many other things in the world of art, crime writing also has its own grammar, and any crime writer, I guess, learns simply by reading a lot. Christie, Holmes, Nicholas Blake. You just keep reading, and there are certain things which appeal to you and which stay with you, so to speak. And you talked about puzzles. I completely agree with you. At the heart of every crime story, like a detective fiction story, a mystery story, lies a baffling puzzle. Something that seems very easy to solve, but when one actually gets to it, one finds that it's not easy as it is seemed, like everything else in the rest of the story. So creating those puzzles is obviously the toughest part of the job. Finding the locals, the exotic locals or the lonely spots, those things come and go. If you're a traveler, you've seen something, it sticks in your mind and it's fine. But and then come the characters, of course. Making the characters interesting is also something which comes naturally to you if you are a writer. But constructing the puzzles, it needs a certain kind of discipline, and that is something which I have always focused on. Which is why I more than who done it, I always call my books as the how done it. Who is okay if there are like 5 of us sitting in a room and one of us end up dead. Even if you ask somebody who knows absolutely nothing about the scenario, he has a 25% chance of guessing who the murderer is. But how? Now that is infinite possibilities. Yeah.
I'm changing the format a little bit. So, Sophie, somebody who's an expert at constructing these sort of clever puzzles as part of your work on writing the. Incidentally, the most important question of the session for today. Let me ask you right away. How do you pronounce Hercules Poirot?
You pronounce it. Is this working? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. You pronounce it Hercule Poirot if you want to say it in a proper French accent, but I don't actually say that all the time. So I say Hercule Poirot. Poirot. But it's amazing. People call him everything. I mean, I've heard that name pronounced in a million different ways. Can I just respond to what you said?
Absolutely. That's what I
When you said it's the how that's crucial, I agree with you that it's not so much the who. Because people often say to me, I guessed who the murderer was in your novel, but I had no idea why or how. I thought I knew who it was and I was right, but that was all I knew. And so that's not really guessing. If you guess who, but not how or why, then you haven't guessed. But for me, the why is more important than the how. Is that not the case for you?
Well, it is. There is a story which I've written called Penumbra, in which we do talk about the why. However, having said that, it is important, of course, but I somehow feel that while between the why and the how, I would like to give precedence to the how. Why is also important, and I'd like to arrive at it because the detective needs to explain what the motive was and needs to get to it, because without the why, even the how will, crumble. But I would, simply from a logical perspective, I would like to imagine that for me, the how is more important than the why.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think it depends on the individual story. Because, for example, if we use Agatha Christie as an example, her novel Murder in Mesopotamia, I don't know whether any of you have read that, if you remember, it all rests on this idea that a woman was killed while in a room, and somehow it's established that nobody could have entered that room to kill her, and yet she went into the room alive, and when the door was finally opened, she was dead. And somehow it's known that no one went into that room, so how could she have been killed? Now, the satisfaction of the solution of that novel is precisely the how. When you find out how the murderer managed to kill a woman in a closed room without going into that room physically, that's a brilliant moment of revelation. So I think it depends on the type of story. Some of them it's the how, some of them it's the why, and some of them it's probably the who as the main. So it's whichever one is the most surprising component, right?
Just to give you an example, I'm sorry, but for example, the ABC murders, a classic example where the who is perhaps the most important part of the story. Mesopotamia is something which probably the how is the most important. In other cases, there is the why, of course. Yeah, yeah.
So at some point, I will bring Philip and Kiran into the discussion for a slightly different genre of crime writing, which is, I think, more thriller. And you know what Hitchcock says, the revelation and the denouement versus sharing information and not obscuring it. You know, so what he says is suspense is all about of bringing light, whereas mystery is all about keeping it in shadows. And you go through a different type of experience, right? I mean, you can have a more emotional experience when you're dealing with suspense, but you can have a more intellectual experience when you're dealing with mystery. So I will draw you into that conversation as we come in. But for the moment, quickly, would you like to read out something from one of your works, very quickly?
Right, from one of my own works, yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. The bloodier the better, but I leave the choice to you.
Well, this is my second novel in the series, in the mystery series. It's called Here Falls the Shadow. It starts with a couple of lines from T.S. Eliot's The Hollow Men. Between the idea and the reality, between the motion and the act, falls the shadow. And there's a reason why it's there, which I'd leave you to discover as you read the story. The beginning is always the most important and also the most difficult. Once the beginning flows out well, the rest of it sort of finds itself. Sangram Talukdar looked at the waterman in his hand as its nib hovered in mid-air, inches away from the pristine sheet of paper, still unsure, still hesitant. This state of mind wasn't unfamiliar to him. He gave it time. He had an old uncle who, upon waking up one fine morning, realized, much to his surprise, that he was finding it difficult to knock on doors. He would raise his hand, turn his knuckle outwards, but would just not be able to knock. His hand would tremble inches away from the wooden panel, hesitating. It was a disease, the old man had told him, a psychological one. As Sangram watched the gold-plated nib struggling to penetrate the invisible barrier between itself and the virgin sheet of paper, he wondered if he should visit a doctor himself, just to rule the nagging thought of the disease out of his head. But then again, he thought he was a perfectly healthy man of 37. Why should he lend any importance to such stupid thoughts? He was Sangram Talukdar at the peak of his career, author of more than a dozen best-selling novels, winner of several awards, and more importantly, millions of hearts. Gathering his thoughts together and making a conscious effort, Sangram put his pen to paper and began to write. When he had written the first sentence, a deliberately long one, he read it and then read it again. A soft smile tugged at the corners of his lips, but it quickly disappeared as he turned his head and looked towards the window on the far wall of the room. The dogs had been barking for some time, several of them. The compound itself had 2 dogs. The street outside was dark and had at least a half a dozen more, and they had all seen something. "Hariya," Sangram called out, his voice ringing loud in the silence of the night. The servant didn't respond. It was well past midnight. He would have slept off by now. And Hariya was as famous in the household for his amazing ability to toil as for his deep slumber when he got to it at the end of the day. The light from the solitary table lamp was not enough to fill the mammoth room. This room used to be Sangram's father's, but ever since he had been crippled by arthritis 3 years ago, he had been living in a room downstairs. Now he spent most of his time in his armchair listening to music. The Talukdar mansion was old and had more than 50 rooms, although only a part of the building was being used right now. The rest was dilapidated and uninhabitable, although the plans had been made time and again for renovating those sections. Sangram slid the pen's cap over the nib, placed the pen on the paper and rose from his mahogany desk. For a moment or two, he considered his next course of action. His heart was already beating faster than usual. He remembered how he had breathed a sigh of relief when he landed at Ranchi airport a few days ago, rejoicing at the thought of putting his troubles behind, if only for a few weeks. Had he celebrated too soon? Very carefully, Sangram made his way across the room, past the majestic four-poster bed, to the window that looked down onto the lawns below. It was pitch dark outside. There was a street light just outside the main gate, but Harya had said it hadn't been working for several months now. If you looked carefully, you could make out the faint outline of the hills in the distance, a thin zigzag line that separated a rising mass of black from the dark grey of the sky. Sangram leaned closer to the window, trying to figure out what the dogs were barking at. No, it was impossible to see anything. The light in the room only made the world outside seem darker. Not a soul seemed to be awake. In a small town like this, any time after 8 in the evening seemed like the dead of the night anyway. And there were plenty of forests all around. Foxes, bears and boars often wandered out of the jungle into the outskirts of the town. Several years ago, when Sangram was not even born, the big cats used to roam around freely too. Was it an animal that the dogs had seen, or perhaps a homeless vagabond? Sangram walked up to the door of the room, ensured that it was locked from the inside, and made his way back to his desk. He read the solitary sentence on the sheet of paper again. He stared at it for a few seconds absent-mindedly and then turned his glance towards an antique baccarat paperweight placed next to his diary. He pulled out 2 open envelopes from under the paperweight and looked at them for a few moments. Very carefully, he brought a sheet of paper out of the first envelope and unfolded it. It was a plain white sheet with only 4 words written on it, handwritten in red ink. Think of your sins. Sangram stared at the words for some time with a frown. Then he folded the sheet, kept it aside and turned towards the other envelope. Same paper, same red ink, but 3 words this time. Prepare to die. Sangram didn't seem afraid, but his frown deepened. He was lost in his thoughts for a few moments when he suddenly realized that the dogs weren't barking anymore. There was no other sound except that of the crickets chirping and a faraway whistle of a shunting goods train. He sat in his chair for a long time, feeling a sense of discomfort and foreboding. Something was not right. Something was just not right. He could sense it. So,
Hello. Thank you so much for that. And I think this is the point where the dogs are killed by 2 swift arrows. Just want to shift gears a little bit. So to your, sort of book that we're discussing today, Kiran and Philip. So Kiran, to begin with you, you've explored a wide range of genres in your writing. The classic detective story books on other subjects, but Missing Presumed Dead sort of falls in. I don't know if psychological thriller is the right word to use, because that's the sort of genre that you've talked about, but certainly is something that goes beyond the usual chills and thrills of crime fiction, of thriller writing, into much more serious territory. It describes a broken marriage that's been torn apart by emotional disturbance, mental illness, fairly serious interpersonal and societal issues, explorations of the human condition, so to speak, for lack of a better term. So is that difficult to do? How does the thriller format lend itself to something which is much more serious than the traditional crime thriller or crime fiction?
Nilanjan, to be honest, I didn't start writing this book thinking about the genre. I started writing this from the point of view of the protagonist. So the protagonist came first for me, and her mind space was the first point from which the plot developed. It was primarily a woman who was trapped in an abusive marriage, and struggling with mental issues of her own. What would that woman do if she's isolated, if she's in a space where she can't trust anyone or anything? And that was the fulcrum from which the entire plot developed. I have written other genres, yes. In my first book, which is The Reluctant Detective, there are two bodies. But that wouldn't be a classic. And there is a detective, and there is a detective sidekick, but that isn't a classic thriller or a crime. It was more humor. This one is more psychological thriller, I would say, more domestic noir. And the story, there is, with classic crime thrillers, the plot, the intricate details, the red herrings are so integral to this. In my story and this particular kind of genre, I think it's more the emotional landscape of the people concerned, the unreliability of the narrator, the two narrators that I have, and it is how their story progresses from their mindscape. So a lot of it, I think the reader has to work with me. I'm not giving a lot of clues away, and I like to think that every reader has interpreted this book and the ending of the book differently. There isn't one ending that somebody has come up with.
So the unreliable narrator is a lovely little phrase, I think. I don't know, would you say Roger Ackroyd was an unreliable narrator?
That's a big question. Technically you'd have to say no, because,
Yes.
it depends what we mean by unreliable narrator. I suppose in the spirit of how it's meant, then the Roger Ackroyd narrator is unreliable, but he doesn't ever lie. He does not ever lie
Absolutely.
to the reader, and his account that we read as his first-person narration is his diary that he is constructing deliberately as an artifact with a view to how it will come over to a reader. So I think Christie is definitely playing fair with the reader, but according to our contemporary definition of unreliable, you'd have to say he is.
I would probably go with her because I find Roger Ackroyd is a fascinating example of a very reliable, truthful, but, well, what should I say, untrustworthy narrator. Your narrator, though, sounds like more on the Gone Girl type of thing.
I'm not going to give away stuff here. No, it isn't. It is a dysfunctional marriage, yes. Okay. But there are no lies. It's like everyone has a different perspective. So marriage viewed from the husband's perspective and from the wife's perspective are two different perspectives altogether. Who is truthful, who is lying, there's no one to say. It's left to the reader to decide what the true story really is in the entire thing.
Sure. Would you like to read a little bit about the book? Sure. Little passage, maybe.
A little passage.
Or if you've got something which the same incident is described by these two people in a Rashomon-like narrative, I leave that to you.
So I'll read from this book, which is my latest. It's called Missing Presumed Dead, and a very short passage. He focused his anger on Ayesha as she stood between him and the door of the children's room, her back straight and her gaze as steady as it could be. Ayesha, have you been going through my things? His voice had gone soft, deceptively soft. You think I wouldn't notice when my things have been messed with? How many times have I told you to stop going through my things? She shrugged indifferently, a non-committal gesture that hovered on the precipice between acceptance and denial. What are you hoping to find? Why are you so suspicious? Ayesha went through his drawers to check out his correspondence. There was stuff that concerned her too. Things that he kept hidden from her. Things she had a right to know. She did so regularly, but he had not figured it out so far. She must have pushed things back in a hurry or opened something and not kept it back in the way it had been kept originally. She hadn't checked his things in a couple of days or more. And she was always meticulous about placing everything as it was, down to the level of random disarray that she knew he created, as a trap to get her OCD into action. There was a brief moment of silence. Then he spoke again. Have you stopped taking your medicines? She didn't bother to respond. He moved a step towards her and grabbed her hand. She stepped back instinctively, trying to free her hand, and tripped over a small step. She fell with a thud against the door she had just closed, her hands clawing at air to steady herself and finding nothing to break her fall. She felt a sharp sting in her lips, where her tooth bit on it sharply and the metallic taste of fresh blood swirled up in her mouth. "I am fed up of you," he shouted. "I've had enough of you with your madness and your suspicions." "Stop it," a voice shouted from the top of the stairs, and swift footsteps came clattering down. "Here." She bent over Ayesha in a strangely protective gesture, interjecting herself between Prithvi and Ayesha, blocking him from reaching Ayesha. He stood over both of them, looking at them with a very perplexed expression for a long, heavy moment, then turned away, climbing up the stairs, going into the bedroom, and slamming the door shut. Ayesha's eyes did not fill up with tears. Those would come later, she knew. And with them would come the howls. She would stuff the hand towel in her mouth and muffle after locking herself in the bathroom. She went, her knees shaking into the spare bathroom by the landing, and washed her face with a calmness that knew the procedure to be followed after such an incident.
Thank you so much, Kiran. For, like they say in the Phantom Comics, for those of you who came in late, we apologize because the session was, advanced by 15 minutes. We have Bhaskar, Chattopadhyay, Kiran Manral, Sophie Hannah, and Philip McLaren today joining us on this panel. We've just done a quick session with Bhaskar on the classic whodunit and where his sources of inspiration come from. And then we had a little discussion on, the whodunit versus the thriller type of genres, which I will sort of take to Philip now. Philip, we just heard Kiran, sort of using this medium to talk about an intimate portrait of a marriage that's going wrong. When I sort of look at the sort of things you've written, the concern seems to be wider and more societal. I might be mistaken. In fact, it has been said somewhere in one of your interviews that if you really want to read a country, read its crime novels. You've been described as an indigenous Australian, tracing your ancestry to the foothills of the Warrumbungle Mountains in New South Wales. And your thriller, Innocent Abroad, begins with a tribal song, Wiringan, or Clever Man, and it describes the journey of, I think, an indigenous artist who goes to the art world of Paris. So it seems to me that you've used this medium to talk about larger societal and maybe even political issues. Is that right? And how would you sort of describe your writing?
Yes, that's a big question. Is this on? It's working, yeah. I need to pay my respects to the Haki people, who are the original inhabitants of this land. I'm a Camilla Roy man, and it's in our culture to pay respects when you're on somebody else's land.
Sorry, small interruption. Is that clear? Is the audio clear? It's clear? Okay.
So that it's a culture. Okay. It's in our culture to pay respects to the original people of this land. I'm from the Camilla Roy people in New South Wales. We're quite a large community, but our language is pretty much dead. I think there are about 10 speakers left. I write out of some sort of respect to my people. They're the protagonists in all my works. I really don't consider myself a crime writer, although I have crimes happen in my books. My first crime novel that was called a crime novel wasn't a police procedural at all. It was really we knew who did it from the first page. And I go into the mind of the killer. There's a serial killer and he's killing and raping Aboriginal women. He has his penchant for Aboriginal women, and he's a terrible guy. And I go inside this guy's head and have him tell the viewer he's narrating his side of the story at the same time that the newly established Aboriginal homicide squad are trying to track this guy down. They're politically appointed. There is no such thing. In Australia, Aboriginal deaths are not investigated properly at all, which is the reason that I wrote this book. I wanted to write shine a light on some of the social aspects of present-day Aboriginal people, the people that live in the cities of Australia, like me. And there are many issues that Aboriginal people face in Australia, and I wanted to let them know. But I wanted to let people know about it in a popular genre, and I chose very deliberately this genre, and I've gone on to write various other thrillers that I don't think are crime writing. I write about the mining of Aboriginal sacred sites by multinationals. They just come into an Aboriginal community and they just bulldoze the whole community with all the sacred sites and all of the features of the landscape that the Aboriginal people find so dear to them, and as part of their ancient heritage of thousands of years. Some of this history goes back 70,000 years. It's survived 2 ice ages, and it's quite dear to them, but it makes no difference to multinationals who are just after the billions of dollars that is in the ground. So the person you're talking about, a clever man, there are clever men in Australian Aboriginal society that these people are extraordinary people. The Americans call them witch doctors. They're able to fly through the air and appear anywhere that they want to. And so I've introduced one of these characters as an intermediary storytelling. He's virtually summing up what you've just read or what you're about to read. And it's a very short verse. So that's what I've done with that.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you. I mean, very, very interesting in the way that you've. There are, I think, a lot of. I mean, you can care to disagree, but you might want to disagree. But I think there are a lot of crime fiction writers who can sort of distance themselves from their creation. You know, you create the intellectual puzzle, you create the character, and then you have fun with it, so to speak. But I think in your case, what you're writing about is very close to your experiences and your life, and that's very interesting. I just like to bring the two of you in. I mean, just to take off from where what he was referring to, which is the crime fiction genre, making social commentary in a way, discussing or bringing in, what's happening around us. And now, for a country which is full of social tensions, fractures, as complex and heterogeneous as India, where we have our own wise men, many godmen, and so on as well. Do you find this is an area which has not been very well explored among Indian crime writers, or are we sort of still in the mode of the conventional detective story and the convention thriller? Just a quick view from both of you.
So,
or if you're aware of any writers who are bringing in these larger societal concerns into their writing.
so the subgenre of crime fiction that I usually dwell in, as it is very, very infrequent in our literature, to be very honest with you, which is why in the first place I, wanted to take a shot at it. But whatever little there is, you are right, there isn't much of a social commentary on them, and I myself am guilty as charged. I haven't taken the opportunity to make a social commentary in a direct way. Having said that, I would love to, because I guess that it is virtually impossible to keep that away from my writing. But I guess I just need to find the right time to get into it, basically, and the story also has to lend it to it, To your other question, do I know of any crime writers who have dwelled on that subject of whatever is happening in current times? I personally feel that there's somebody who's sitting right next to me, from whatever little I've heard from her book, is something which is a social commentary on how women are being treated in the country these days. Yeah. I almost stole your answer.
So he said it all for me.
Okay.
I just like to add maybe crime fiction. I think in the space of the thrillers, we have Ravi Subramaniam, who talks a lot about the issues that have been plaguing our banking industry and the business side of things. Not in fiction so much. I see a lot of our non-fiction focusing on very good crime stories, which are social commentary. So we have Hussain Zaidi, who writes very relevant books on the mafia queens. We have so many other non-fiction that does focus on social issues. But Avirok did a wonderful book on Arushi. So we have a lot of non-fiction that focuses on crime, which is very well written and strong social comments on what's happening. But in the fiction space, I think we still have to catch up a fair bit.
No, I think you're right. On non-fiction, there is a fair amount. And I think it's also a very difficult balancing act. You have to sort of combine your anger with your cleverness in a way, right? Because I don't know whether you will be insulted or feel good about this, but when I read about your books, I was reminded a little bit about Stieg Larsson and his concerns about the whole sort of neo-Nazi movement growing in Scandinavia, and there is a lot of anger in that book. There is, of course, I think it's very well written, it's very pacey, very sharp, all of that, but I also sense a fair amount of anger that is genuine anger that's there in the book, and I think that's a very difficult balancing act. Would you like to read out a little bit from your any of your novels to give us a flavor? Philip, for those of you who came in late, has travelled all the way from Australia to be with us today, and we'd love to listen to him.
This book, as I mentioned, is it's called Scream Black Murder. It's about an Aboriginal rookie Aboriginal detectives that were put in place to investigate Aboriginal crimes, which in real life are not well investigated at all. They're kind of shunted to the side. They're not even real crimes. The white people investigate the white crimes and neglect the Aboriginal crimes. So I decided to address that and have my cops come through, and they're politically appointed, and now they've appeared for their first case. Human flesh decays 5 times more slowly when wet. The rain began at 2 in the morning. By 3, the naked bodies which lay in the shallow stormwater drain beside the railway track were half covered by a fast-running stream. Long blue streaks flashed, leaving white comet trails as they crackled and peeled away from the overhead electric cables. The State Rail Authority early morning passenger service was running on time despite the downpour. The train's headlights shone brilliantly white on the scene as it negotiated the gentle bend out of Redfern Station. Police flares attracted stares from passengers through the windows of the accelerating carriages. The sweltering heat from the last day of the year had continued overnight, and the rain fell relentless. The entire Aboriginal community from Everleigh Street were assembled in the children's playground at the top of the steep rise near the railway tracks. They stood together under umbrellas, in raincoats, or beneath large orange plastic sheeting. 2 policemen prevented the crowd from moving nearer the scene while directing the curious in their slow-moving vehicles to pass quickly. A green unmarked police sedan with a flashing red beacon on the dash panel steered onto the footpath, coming to a stop on a grassy patch beside 4 other police vehicles. Gary Leslie and Lisa Fuller, the full complement of the newly formed Aboriginal Homicide Unit of the New South Wales Police Department, sorry about that. They stepped gingerly out of the car into the heavy rain. They were met by an ashen-faced young constable with fast-growing rivulets running down the heavy navy-coloured cape. "Are you Leslie?" he shouted, to be heard above the noise of a passing train. "Yeah," Gary nodded. "Bloody gruesome sight. They're down beside the train line." He looked at the woman. "Are you with him?" "Yes, I'm Detective Fuller. We're together," she said, pursing her perfect orange-painted lips in a crooked smile. "Sorry, just go down by the fence. That's the easiest way to get down there," he said. Then he moved away quickly to intercept the curious newcomers to the crowd of morbid thrill-seekers who had now pushed forward, hoping to steal a glimpse of the bodies.
Thank you so much, Philip. We are a little pressed for time right now. I thought we were doing good, but I see from the clock that we're a little pressed for time. So, Sophie, for someone who's successfully sort of straddled these worlds of the classic whodunit through your Hercule Poirot novels, three of them, a fourth in the offing, and your earlier works as well as your subsequent works, you've sort of straddled both these worlds. You must have been asked this a million times before, but what's the experience been? Is that difficult to do? How do you find, the pleasures and pains of writing in either genre?
Well, my psychological thrillers, although on the surface they're very different from my Poirot novels, in terms of the actual kinds of stories I'm telling, they're not that different. So even before I wrote Poirot novels, I was operating according to a sort of Agatha Christie blueprint of what the ideal crime novel should be and do. So, for example, one thing Agatha does over and over again, and it's one of the elements of what makes her so great, is she will always start with a mystery that's more mysterious than usual. So a lot of crime novels just start with a dead body, and the mystery is who killed the dead body. And we kind of quite want to know, but we can imagine various possible answers, can't we? Straight away, dead body, well, someone might have killed them because they were very angry with them or because they were jealous. Agatha started her books with something so weird in each case that the reader can't even begin to speculate why that thing might happen. And so you're immediately hooked because you think, well, I've got to read this book because how is it going to be resolved? I can't see a way. And so I was doing that anyway, before I started writing Poirot. My first ever published crime novel, which is called Little Face, is about a husband and wife, who cannot agree about whether the baby in the house is their baby or not. The wife goes out on her own, leaving the baby at home with her husband. When she comes back, she starts screaming and insists it's a different baby. And the husband says, "What are you talking about? Of course it's the same baby. Just look at her, it's her." And the wife says, "It's not her. You've swapped her for another baby while I was out." Now, that's Agatha-ish, I think, even though there's no trace of Poirot in that book. So, for me, being asked to write Poirot was almost like being invited to come out of the closet, because I was already secretly writing what I saw as very Agatha-inspired mystery stories.
Much. Would you want to mention a couple of these very unusual beginnings that that have sort of stuck in your head? The clocks
from Christie.
The clocks, maybe.
From Christie. Oh, I mean, there's so many. So, A Murder is Announced, which is a very good Miss Marple novel. That starts with an advertisement in the local newspaper saying, "There will be a murder at 6:30 p.m. today." And you see each of the villagers in turn reading this in the paper. And they say, they're all at their breakfast tables and they turn to their families and say, "Oh, look, it says in the paper there's going to be a murder at so-and-so's house. Shall we go round and watch?" And then it cuts to the house where the murder is advertised as being planned to take place. And the owner of that house responds in the same way. She says, "Oh, look, it says in the paper that there's going to be a murder here later. Well, I suppose I'd better get some tea and scones in because, everyone will turn up." And that is a brilliant high-concept mystery because you cannot imagine why any murderer would advertise in the paper that they were going to commit a murder. And she did it time and time again.
And I think her great genius lies in the fact that when you read the whole story, you see how necessary it was. It wasn't only for effect. It was because the murderer could commit the crime in a very, very clever way, and therefore the sort of outlandish effect was necessary, and that's what I find very, very remarkable.
And so what Agatha does over and over again, and so I try to do this as well because I'm very much in her, literary model. She shows you. She starts off by presenting you with something that looks impossible. It's just so implausible, it's impossible, and you think, she's never going to pull this off. By the end of the book, it makes complete logical sense, and you see that, of course, the story started like this. Once the picture is complete, it's a perfectly logical picture, but it's one that you would never have anticipated or guessed.
I'm going to ask you to do a quick reading, no more than 1.5 minutes. I'm timing you. Is that possible, or would you like to...
What I'm going to do... And I haven't asked anyone's permission, so I hope I'm allowed to do this. I'm going to sing you a bit of a song.
Wonderful.
Because, good, thank you. I'm glad you're all keen on that idea. Very quickly, I have written a murder mystery musical because I love murder mysteries and I love musicals. And so it's a country house puzzle with a murder and a detective and lots of suspects and a police inspector who boasts about how brilliant he is. And he in this song, which is called Clewmont, he's singing about how at the denouement of every murder, he always solves the crime. So it's kind of self-referential. It is about the genre of crime writing, and how the detective always gets it in the detective always gets the right answer in the denouement scene. Okay, so unfortunately, I'm going to have to sing it without an orchestra. Normally I have an orchestra, and indeed normally someone's singing it who's a better singer than me. But never mind all of those things. So the chorus goes, I arrive at each denouement, and I walk into the roomont, and immediately know whomont is the one that did the deed. While he yells, to hell with you, Mont, I explain what's false and true, Mont, from my expert point of view, Mont, and success is guaranteed. Yes, success is guaranteed. There you go.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's the first for me too. We have just a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to ask you in wrapping up and before we move on to... We were told 11:25. I have 5 minutes left. Yeah? You have 5 minutes left. Yeah. Okay, very quick rapid fire question and then we hand it over to the audience for some interactions. Okay, Bhaskar, these questions, the answers to these questions must be given faster than a body thrown off a cliff, right? So quick ones. The best way to get rid of a body?
I would never imagine why I'd like to hide a body. I'd like the body to be found and the murder to be pinned on somebody else. Yeah.
All right. Philip, your favorite villain in crime fiction?
Silence of the Lambs, Hannibal Lecter.
Ah, okay.
He's a cannibal.
Hannibal Lecter, Silence of the
He's an
Lambs.
intellectual, yeah.
All right. Sophie, the most unusual motive for murder that you're aware of?
Agatha Christie's After the Funeral. After the Funeral. The surface motive is an obvious one, but beneath that obvious motive, there's another layer of motive which is so massively unusual and weird and brilliant. Well worth rereading After the Funeral if you haven't read it recently.
Kiran, the most exotic murder weapon you're aware of?
There's a short story by Roald Dahl where she uses a frozen steak from the freezer to kill her husband, and then she cooks it and she serves it.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah, I've given away the story, the plot of the story, but that was the most unusual weapon I ever read about.
Yeah, a leg of lamb. Evidence is eaten up by the investigator. It is a brilliant story. The best plotter in the business, Sophie. Plotter.
Well, I'm going to say someone who's still alive. You all know how I feel about Agatha by now, so I don't need to mention her again. My favourite living crime writer is an Irish writer called Tana French, who is an absolutely brilliant writer and a brilliant plotter.
All right. Kiran, who makes better murderers, men or women, and why?
I think women are more subtle, So I would like to think that when they decide to go evil, do it better.
Okay. Subtle and secret. Philip, Scandinavian, British, or fill in the blanks, your preferred genre?
Oh,
Australian?
American. Walter Mosley. American.
Okay.
Yeah, black American.
All right. And last one, Bhaskar, the best detective of all time.
Feluda.
Okay. Parochialism speaks there, Feluda. Thank you, all of you. Been a lovely, lovely session with all of you. Do we have a couple of minutes for any audience interactions? So would you want to pass around the mic? Questions preferred, not so much commentary. And if you want to name the person. You want to use this?
So my question is just for like for aspiring writers, if you could give, each of you could give a little advice on where do the ideas come from in general? I mean, or maybe every time it's different, but like how do you think up such outlandish things and then come up? It's also like, do you think from beginning to end and then start writing, or does the story develop as you go? Just a little bit about your story writing style, you know, if each of you could comment on that.
Well, in terms of outlandish ideas, and my books are generally based on outlandish ideas, that's the part that's effortless for me, because I just have outlandish ideas. I struggle to have an ordinary, normal idea. And my husband always says, when I say to him, do you think anyone will guess the solution? He goes, no. No one would come up with anything as weird as your brain can create. The piece of advice I would give aspiring writers is believe in your story, because people will try to discourage you. When I had my idea about the woman who insists her baby has been swapped for another baby, an agent who wanted to take me on and wanted to represent the book said, I've just got one bit of advice. Instead of having her say to her husband, this is not our baby, I think you should have her say to him, this is not your baby. And I said, but then there's no mystery about the identity of the baby. Then it's just a story about a woman confessing to infidelity. And this agent said, yeah, I think that would be more realistic, because babies don't get swapped very often. So if you've got a story you want to tell, don't let some idiot talk you out of it.
Look, stories just float in from the ether. I don't know where they come from, but I have no trouble in coming up with ideas for stories. And I think beginning writers should just do it, really. I probably wouldn't, you know, say write an entire novel. Most publishers will take 3 chapters and an outline. Write every day is another thing. I'll just write every day.
For me, it's not so much the story and the plot as the protagonist. So for me, I need to be able to visualize the protagonist in my head. She, primarily because my protagonists have been female, completely down to the last detail. When the person is a living creature in my head, then her story flows out. That's the way it works for me. I've worked both ways, plotting the entire novel as well as writing organically. I think each story decides how it needs to be written. Some work better when you write organically and let the story grow. Some work better when you plot it down to the last detail. Of course, with murder mysteries, you have to plot it down to the last detail, because if you don't do that, you'll have something lying around and you need to go back and rework stuff. For aspiring writers, as Philip said, write every day. Read a lot. Read like 10,000 times more than you would ever write. So that's important.
Well, we had a professor in B school who told us that when you are just sitting in a chair and doing nothing, it's not really that you are doing nothing, you are thinking. I guess that's my secret. I'm sorry, but I don't know anything else to say. I just sit in a chair and think.
folks, let us know when we need to.
Good morning to all the panelists. This is a question for you all. I would like to know how you incorporate psychological elements of the character in their character sketches.
So I try to write all my characters from inside their heads. So, you know, sometimes often in fact, people say to me, how come your protagonists, who are usually all women, apart from Poirot, how come your protagonists are as flawed and, you know, horrible in some ways as the villain? And the reason for that, I mean, I love all my main characters. I love flawed people. I don't believe there's any other kind of person in the world apart from flawed people. But the reason my characters seem very flawed is that I'm writing from their point of view, from inside their heads. And we all know that inside our own heads, we have unworthy thoughts. You know, sometimes you can be chatting to someone absolutely lovely, and in the privacy of your own head, you can be thinking, yeah, you're lovely, but I wish you'd shut up because you're really boring. And so when we have those thoughts, we are unsympathetic characters, and other times we have nicer thoughts. But you know, I feel that if you write from inside the character, then you're going to see everything, the good and the bad. And that, for me, is the way of achieving psychological accuracy.
I made a study of psychology before I became a writer, so I was really interested in the way that people behave, especially in public places, but also towards each other. So in my character developments, I relied on my psychology studies, really. That's what I did. I took on a challenge once for my 5th novel of writing a book that is not plot-driven, that is character-driven. So I developed those characters, and they're loosely linked in a series of dreams. So I was able to develop those characters quite in depth.
For me, it was... the previous book I've written is about a lady who is 78 years old, so I have some time to get there. So, to writing about her was basically a lot of observation of the 70-plus women around, also a lot of research. I think research is very, very important. It came down to a point where I actually had pain in my knees, and I was feeling my back going out on me, and, you know, I couldn't digest stuff because I was living that person as I was writing her. My most recent book is about a woman with a lot of mental illnesses. She's OCD, she's bipolar, So there was a lot of research, there was a lot of talking to women specifically, and also to caregivers who lived with people with those specific issues. So I would like to also add research as a very important factor.
Well, in our day-to-day interactions with people, we often come across a wide range of people with wide range of views and opinions. And it's very natural for us to, try to shut away people whose opinions we don't like or we don't value. I would say one of the best ways to try and write good characters is to give time to those people, even time in your thoughts, try to understand what they were trying to say, even if you don't agree with it. Just give them time and try to understand where they're coming from, what would their motivations be, and so on and so forth. By doing that, you get a very good understanding of different kinds of people, even people who are not your kind. That's what my process is, actually.
Thank you, everyone. I mean, crime, as you know, is as old as humanity itself, and we could go on and on, but then, all bad things must come to an end. And thank you so much, Philip, Sophie, Kiran, and Bhaskar, for your time here. For those of you who are, having some murderous thoughts now, inspired by this session, we suggest you put them down on paper and don't act on them. Thank you so much for being such a lovely and generous audience. Have a good day.